Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining our panel discussion, Lessons Learned from the EU-Turkey Migration Deal. We would like to take a deep dive into the agreement between the EU member states and Turkey, which came into effect in March 2016. During the next 50 minutes, we would like to answer the key question: can the EU-Turkey deal be a blueprint for G20, and if so, how? Let me just say a few words again on the deal, so we're all on the same page. At its heart, the agreement aimed to address the flow of smuggled migrants and asylum seekers across the Aegean from Turkey to the Greek islands by allowing Greece to return to Turkey all new irregular migrants arriving after March 20, 2016. In exchange, it was agreed that EU member states would increase resettlement of Syrian refugees residing in Turkey, accelerate visa liberalization for Turkish nationals, and boost existing financial support for Turkey's refugee population. More than a year later now, we would like to explore if the EU-Turkey deal on migration can be a blueprint for other cooperation between G20 members and third countries, and if so, how it needs to be designed in order to benefit refugee populations and hosting communities without compromising on fundamental rights and values. Before I introduce our panelists here, let me just briefly outline the session. It works a little bit different than what we saw in the morning. We have a general discussion, not a fixed format. And we have about 50 minutes in total, of which I would like to reserve at least 10 to 15 minutes for questions from the audience. And in order to jump right into the details, I have asked our panelists here to prepare a 2 to 3 minute statement to answer the poignant question in the beginning: EU-Turkey deal, success or failure? What works, what doesn't work? So on the panel we have Saime Özçürümez, who is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration and associate dean at the Faculty of Administrative Economics and Social Sciences at Bilkent University. She was a visiting scholar at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University in 2015 and 2016. Her research and publication focus on migration policy in the European Union, Turkey and Canada. Welcome, Saime. Gerald Knaus, on the left, is the head of the European Stability Initiative, a think tank for Southeast Europe and enlargement. He studied in Oxford, Brussels and Bologna, and he was a senior fellow of the Mercator Foundation and lives in Berlin and Istanbul. In 2015, he published a paper called The Merkel Plan, which came to be the basic outline of the EU-Turkey deal on migration. Welcome, Gerald. And to my right here is Karl Kopp. He's a social scientist by training and has been working for the human rights organization Pro Asyl in Frankfurt since 1992. He's a director for European Union politics and is a board member of the European umbrella organization ECRE. Gerald, I would like to start with you. In your statement, the EU-Turkey migration deal, success or failure, what works, what doesn't work?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for this invitation, this opportunity to look back at this agreement or statement, which really, it is not a legal agreement, it is based on existing laws, existing agreements, and political commitments. 3 things I think have worked, and 3 things have not worked very well. What has worked has been obviously the reduction in irregular arrivals, and linked to that, the reduction in the number of people drowning in the Aegean. At this moment, and I was just in Greece last week, we have around 40 people a day on average that arrive on the Aegean islands. That's 1,200 a month. In January and February 2016, it was 60,000 a month, and 360 people drowned. So this has worked. Secondly, it has stuck. Turkey and the EU have not walked away from this because it has turned out to be in both of their interests. And thirdly, and linked to this, it's been in Turkey's interest because Turkey had to take back very few people from the EU, from the Greek islands. In the first 12 months, around 916 people were taken. Now it's above 1,000, 1,100. But Turkey received a huge amount of money, the biggest aid the EU has ever given to another country to deal with refugees on its territory. 2 times 3 billion were promised, more than 800 million already spent, and this is having an impact. What has not worked quickly? Well, the legal access that was promised for larger numbers of Syrian refugees from Turkey to the EU has been very disappointing for those like us who've been pushing and hoping that this would be a historic breakthrough. Larger numbers of people finding a legal way to the EU. It's been a few thousand. That's not good. Secondly, reception conditions and the asylum service in Greece. It wasn't a surprise that they would be overburdened. Everybody knew that. What was a surprise for me is that even though the numbers were very small, in the end, still, despite massive EU financial support, the management on the islands has been, well, to put it politely, very disappointing. And I'm sure many human rights organizations have written about this. All the criticism is more than justified. And thirdly, the relocation from Greece that the EU has also promised has also been very slow. So Greece has seen itself, despite this agreement, reducing the numbers of people arriving, last year struggling with a very large number of people on the mainland and on the islands.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kopp.
Okay, concerning the Turkey deal, we would say the deal, we would like to avoid the term deal. We talk about refugee protection, and the deal is quite the opposite of refugee protection. We have now deal after deal, Turkey deal, Libya deal, whatever, deal, created a humanitarian disaster on the Aegean island. The preconditions of the deal to say Turkey is a safe third country, or the Commission also stressed Turkey is a safe country of origin, is wrong. And this assumption is the key principle to force many people on the island, more than 10,000, to stay, to be trapped, to wait for a procedure, for a high-tech border procedure under inhumane conditions. So on the Greek side, the deal created a mess, and it's quite, and nobody is responsible. Gerald mentioned maybe the Greek management, but on the other hand, it was the will of the political leaders in Europe to implement the deal. It's not a legal document, as we heard. It's a hybrid approach to force Greece in line with EU law or in violation of EU law to implement the deal. So on the Greek side, it created a disaster, an ongoing disaster, and this is, let's say, the counterbalance. If we ask what is the success story, the only success from the political point of view, Gerald mentioned this, is refugees are not able to come anymore. This is blocked, the sea route is blocked. By the way, this is not officially part of the Aegean deal, the Turkey deal. At the land borders, it's surprisingly very low numbers in Greece and Bulgaria. And why is this? Turkey tried to keep control because they stop also their citizens now who want to leave the country. And on the other hand, Greece and Bulgaria are pushing back people in violation of international law. So if you talk about a blueprint, it's quite the opposite of a blueprint concerning a common European asylum system and based on solidarity and human rights. So we would like to quit the part of the deal concerning the safe third country concept, this border procedure, which creates a hell of suffering and depression, and we had dead people in the so-called EU hotspots, and to end with something positive. The Greek lawyers, our friends, were able to block every deportation of Syrian refugees who remain in the procedure. They went to the highest Greek court. We have now the first case last week, it will be communicated this week, an Armenian Syrian will be heard from the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg. We had the first Rule 39 decision concerning a deportation of an Iranian refugee. So what is functioning in this mess of the deal is the Greek civil society, and the Greek lawyers are able to create a proper, successful litigation strategy against the deal and they defend the right to seek asylum in Europe. This is, let's say, the end game concerning the right to seek asylum, and they try hard every day to stop this machinery.
Thank you very much. Özçürümez.
Thank you, Lena. When I received Lena's question about success or failure, from an academic perspective, I started thinking about how do we really assess success and how do we really assess failure. So that was my major issue. So I'm going to approach this from two angles. One of the angles is about the cooperation, coordination capacity of the deal, statement, hybrid approach, however we're trying to name it. And the second one actually speaks to the nature of what it is trying to attempt at. Now, the first one is this is a deal or statement between an international / supranational / intergovernmental / multi-level entity and a nation state, right? And it's trying to address a serious global challenge with one attempt, a deal. Now, from a perspective of trying to understand and compare what can happen with this kind of a situation, I think it can suffer from three major defects. One of them has to do with implementation. Implementation troubles precisely because it is trying to address a really multidimensional question on international protection. What do I mean by this? It's working on refugee protection, it's working on border management, it's working on asylum applications, it's working on a humanitarian scheme. And the asylum applications process itself is complicated because Turkey has a geographical limitation, and it's trying to address the issue from very different perspectives of temporary protection. And also, it's trying to curb irregular migration. So implementation troubles are already there. The second trouble that I could see from this perspective of cooperation coordination is about its sustainability. And the issue here is it has a set budget, right? And Knaus rightly addressed that. And that set budget is for a purpose. But what's going to happen next is not really predictable, or in fact, we're able to forecast it because we don't have real measurements of success or failure other than the numbers that we're talking about. And the third issue that I can see as a problem area is the accountability matters of which institution will hold accountable which one. Now we're at a point that both parties are holding their ends to the matter, but a point might come when there will be no accountability on either part if there is trouble in terms of its sustainability. Now, the other issue is about the nature of the process, and I call this the scale issue. I think the mass influx is its major contender, because the conflict itself is protracted and the numbers are increasing, as the deal itself aims to address, the border management issue and the refugee protection schemes and so on. At the same time, babies are being born, people are aging, their socio-demographic profile is changing, health challenges are increasing, children are losing another day to school and so on. So there is an issue about what we talked about in the morning here, about particularly being inclusive and comprehensive about a strategy on international protection. So these 2 points, the nature and the cooperation coordination dimension, makes it very difficult to call it a success or failure. So my final point is too early to tell within a year and just 5 progress reports.
Thank you very much. Too early to tell, but there are some statistics already been put out, and some researchers say, and even Frontex claims, that the closing of the Balkan route has been much more effective in driving down the numbers of arrivals than the agreement or the deal, the agreement that you prefer not calling it a deal. What is your response to these statistics?
Well, look, in March 2016, when the Turkish Prime Minister made this offer to the German Chancellor and the Dutch Prime Minister in a meeting in the Turkish embassy to the European Union in Brussels. At that time, we already had the closure of the Balkan route. And at that time, every day, more than 1,100 people kept coming to the Greek islands. Every day. Islanders expected this 2016 to be the year of most arrivals ever. And it was actually quite clear to everyone in Greece that, and this was the preparation of the UN agencies, that the idea that Greece could absorb 200,000 people on its mainland, because before that people were on the island, they spent 1, 2, 3 days, then they moved to the mainland, that Greece would be able to afford 200,000 people, that it could cope with them decently in any way, more than Sweden accepted, was a fantasy. It was clear Greece could not do that. But equally, it was a fantasy and remains a fantasy. The idea that you can create a tiny fence of a few kilometers on each side of the border crossing of Greece and Macedonia at Idomeni, because there is no fence along this border. There is a tiny fence where people used to just be able to cross without any problems. And that without Greek support, you can close the Balkan route. The Balkan route has not been closed. If you look at the numbers today, and I bring you the latest numbers that are now based on really solid evidence, because today people in Greece, those who are in Greece, the asylum seekers and refugees and migrants, get some support from UNHCR. So we have a pretty good sense, finally, how many people are there today. Today the estimates are that there are 42,000 people in the whole of Greece, including the islands. So today there are only 7,000 something people on the islands, which means that there are less people in Greece today than there were when the agreement was made. But of course 30,000 people arrived because despite the agreement, so where are they? I mean, what we see is that half the people on the mainland have actually made their way to Germany, Austria. So the reason the numbers fell so fast is because after the agreement with Turkey, the numbers arriving on the Greek islands dramatically dropped from 1,100 within 2 or 3 weeks to 100 a day to 50 a day by the summer. And Greece, as a result, then worked with Macedonia, because Greece had no obligation to take people back from Macedonia that crossed the border. The idea that you can just, as Viktor Orban proposed, build a fence across the Balkans that will make it impossible to cross is a fantasy. It hasn't worked, it wouldn't have worked, and in terms of EU solidarity, it would have been a disaster, because what it would have meant is that the EU, and some countries did that, would support a non-EU member, Macedonia, to lock in, to block refugees, asylum seekers in an EU member, Greece.
Yeah.
And of course, under this scenario, there would have been no support for the refugees in Turkey, no resettlement from refugees from Turkey, and you would have had essentially the whole of Greece turned into a humanitarian disaster zone. Now, the agreement did not create a humanitarian disaster. Today on the island of Chios, and I talked to the mayor just last week again, I mean, it is a shame. There are about 2,400 people on Chios today. They are in very bad conditions, despite massive amounts of money available. There is no security in these camps, Vial and Suda. Yeah. But this is solvable. 2,400 people on Chios is less than those who arrived on that island in the last 4 months.
But Gerald, we hear this now since more than 12 months. Everything is so, there is a solution. But for the people, there is no solution. They are still in a tent. 7th of January, people slept in tents on Lesbos Island. You know the pictures. Thousands of people homeless, yeah, with all the money. So there was a mess, and this mess is not only a Greek mess; it's a combination of Europe, international.
But it's solvable, wouldn't you
Yeah,
say?
but okay, people are arriving now. And concerning your question, you try to avoid this a little bit. Before the closure of the Balkan route, there was a kind of organized way to pass the Balkan, yeah? And with the closure, the smuggling industry came back. Now everything is under control of the smugglers, of the mafia. With all the human rights violations, you know this, people are trapped in different places. Not mainly in Macedonia, they are trapped in Serbia. And you have to combine this. To close, so we had 2 deterrence measures or approaches. One, the coalition of the unwilling, closing the Balkan route. And then the coalition of the willing, let's say the better one. In former times, Merkel, Tsipras, EU Commission, the Dutch, tried to make the Turkey deal with all the submission to your current president. Yeah? Don't talk about human rights violation in Turkey. Avoid the war in the eastern part of Turkey. Don't talk because of the deal. So, but the combination, the closure of the Balkan route and this, okay, this is the comeback of the smuggling industry. It's exactly the opposite what everybody said. Now, for them, it's a perfect timing to have high profits. So you should combine the 2 approaches, and both approaches have only one aim: to get rid of refugees, to keep them in safe, not safe third countries, but in third countries, containment policy, Turkey, Lebanon, the Turkey government was obliged, and everybody was happy when you introduced, not you, but the Turkish government, the transit visa restriction for Syrians from third countries. This closed many ways to Turkey and access to protection. And this is part of the deal, and if we analyze the deal, it's a massive attack against human rights and refugee rights.
But I want to like ask you about the alternatives. What do you suggest?
Yeah.
You say it's solvable. You say there should be something else should be done. So what do you propose?
Yeah, to be fair towards Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, maybe also Iran and other countries, the main host countries for refugees. We always advocated to offer safe and legal ways, for example, from Turkey. We are not in favor of boat people, not from Libya. We don't want that people go to Libya. We don't want that people risk their life. We want an organized, safe and legal way. The problem now is they are not available. Gerald mentioned this 1% resettlement quota we had already. Yeah, you made a proposal, 500,000 resettlement places per year, and now we have, let's say, 5,000 per year. So this is the difference between your idea and the reality. And it's only for Syrians. The problem is now we have to create safe and legal ways. There are different options, resettlement, humanitarian admission programs we had already concerning Syrians and in former times Iraqi refugees. There is an option, this is a big issue, if we unblock the family reunification. People are would not have the obligation to enter a boat. 10,000 are blocked in third countries, bloody safe. The third countries, because they have no right, or they could not implement their right for family reunification. The same increase concerning Dublin, family reunification. Most of the cases increased, trapped people increased, we could solve not via relocation. It was about 15,000 relocation. No, 12 from, I think 12 from Greece to other European countries. But if we would implement the legal ways, if you follow the law, most of the people could join their family in Germany or in other places, because they nearly all have family members here.
So safe and legal ways, family reunification.
And only one sentence. Sorry. And we always said, okay, support these countries financially, create dignified living conditions in Lebanon, in Jordan, and also in Turkey. We advocated for this 5 years ago. Now, only when the refugees arrive in Europe, Europe realized, oh God, we have a problem.
But exactly, that's what I wanted to ask Saime. You visited many of the receiving communities in Turkey, and can you describe a little bit how they are dealing, and also if you can already see an impact after the implementation of the deal?
Thank you, Lena. Now, I think the discussion is going in a very different direction. If we're just going to look at the deal itself and talk about the numbers, actually the deal is putting a great question mark on how we approach international protection and sharing of responsibility in the event of forced migration as a result of humanitarian crises. So we're addressing a symptom by trying to restrict movement. Now, I wrote a couple of articles on irregular migration, and we can't stop it with walls, with restrictive policies, or with expulsion. So there's a serious issue here that by means of talking about irregular migration, we're also approaching an issue about international protection. Why is this a problem? You just mentioned the local communities. Now, this issue is seen as, how they actually move towards Greece and so on, but there is a real issue in the southeastern part of Turkey in about 12 cities where most of these people who are seeking refuge from a humanitarian crisis are now placed for almost more than 6 years now. So there is a long debate that we need to talk about in terms of what's going on there. Not only about their needs, and there the question of local communities becomes important, because about what's going on with the local communities as well. There are social tensions that might arise that we need to think about. It's partially about what we talk about here in terms of access to public services. There's also issues about funds, so where the issue about the money. I mean, Gerald talked about how much that's being spent on it, but it's just a sort of portion of the need that's already there. And in no way we have, and in the morning Dennis talked about economic progress and social progress and estrangement. There's a real sort of question about whether there can be estrangement on the part of the local communities who have been receiving them, thinking that the humanitarian crisis would be over, and changing and framing this issue in another way. So I think it's time to talk about equality and in fact reducing inequality among the local communities who also have a disadvantaged situation and socioeconomically challenging conditions, and with the people who are coming here. If we only talk about it in terms of who moves, you know, and how many moved and how many were able to be kept in Turkey, we'll be really taking this in a very different direction that's not close to solving the real issue that we're trying to address. That is, in fact, establishing conditions that will, in fact, provide them with self-reliant and resilient contexts for their futures.
We've talked about the situation on the ground, as you say, but in general, the political context in which this deal was negotiated has changed, and membership negotiations are frozen now, and you've heard Mr. Kopp is very critical also of one partner in the deal. Do you think that Turkey is still a reliable partner and a safe third country?
Well, I think the first question we have to ask is, what do we do going forward? And I think some of these issues were raised. One of them is, how do we confront the deteriorating human rights situation in Turkey, which is visible, which is clear, and which is deeply worrying. How do we go forward with resettlement? I mean, in the agreement in February, when Angela Merkel and Mark Rutte talked to the Turkish Prime Minister at that time, they talked about 900 people a day. We need to ask why that didn't happen, but it's not because the EU alone decided not to do it. There's also been a real loss of interest in this on the part of the Ankara administration. If Turkey would push for this, I agree with what Karl said about family reunification. It's an obvious interest of the EU to prevent people getting into boats, because if you have family in the EU, once you reach Greece, you cannot be sent back in any case. But of course, what is currently happening is that you enter a legal limbo where you wait, like Kafka, like in a Kafka novel, for your decision to be taken. So we could work on these issues. But what is not possible, and I think this is where, I don't think we disagree, but I think this is where we have a different emphasis. The situation in 2016 of a situation out of control, where around Europe those who said, look, the only way we can solve this is building insurmountable fences and suspending the Refugee Convention and ending support to human rights, which political movements that in end of 2015, 2016 were on the rise around Europe. And we saw what happened in the United States, where a president is elected who basically said the US will walk away from its long-term support to refugees. If you don't win the political battle, if you don't have majority support, if you don't have a number of governments in the EU that say we are willing to help refugees, as Germany has, as Sweden has, then in the end, who are our allies? Then we end up like Australia, which has been having a policy of taking people, putting them on an island, a small number, but for years under bad conditions, and where the public keeps electing parties of center-right, center-left, that have kept this policy in place. Now, I think if we move forward, what we need to do is we need to work on each of the elements of this agreement to improve them. There is no excuse that conditions in Lesbos or Chios, the two main islands, are bad. The money is there. It's not hard to manage. The number of people on these islands today is less than arrived in 3 hours in Passau in 2015. Why is it not happening? We can talk about this in detail.
I would be interested. Why do you think it's not moving forward?
Well, I think one of the reasons is the lack of clear accountability. It's not clear who is really in charge. I think it would have been fair for Greece to be able to demand, I recommend this still to the Greek government, to say to the EU, look, you should set up a decent reception center that meets all the human rights standards of the EU directive on reception on Chios and on Lesbos, put up some management, hire Greeks, but you are then clearly responsible. This is the EU's external border. I think then it would be clear and we would see different pictures. But to get back to your point on Turkey and the human rights situation there, the reason this agreement has stuck, or this statement has stuck, is because it's been in Turkey's interest on its own. Turkey has been taking back less than 80 people a month. The idea, and I agree with what Karl was saying, only I would put a different interpretation on it. The idea that the EU agreed to just send back everyone without due process was always a fiction. I mean, the agreement states clearly that everyone who arrives has to get a hearing and all the legal safeguards apply. And of course lawyers would use that and should use that. Of course courts are involved. The result has been that Turkey has had to take less than 80 people a month since the beginning of this agreement. And for this, it has received, with a major social crisis, more money than any country in the world has ever received from the EU for dealing with refugees. The social assistance to almost 1 million Syrians in Turkey that are getting money every day for their survival, the increase in Syrian children going to school, that has been made possible. Now, why did the EU only give this money? Because it wanted Turkey's help. But is it legitimate? Should we demand for this in other contexts and countries as well? Yes. This means Turkey has no interest in people in large numbers getting on boats again, drowning, the mafia controlling the coast of the Aegean. Turkey has no interest in this money being stolen. And Turkey is not taking back many people because the process on the EU side is not fast. So I don't think this should stop us criticizing human rights violations. And I don't think it has. If you look at the Dutch and the Germans, their relations with Turkey in the last year have deteriorated dramatically. There's no Dutch ambassador in Ankara at the moment. You can't have more of a break in relations. Germany passed the resolution on the Armenian genocide in the middle of the agreement. And Angela Merkel, during the implementation of the agreement. And Angela Merkel has been more critical of human rights in Turkey than any of her colleagues from the UK or from other European countries visiting. This is not the problem. The real problem is that Turkey is facing the largest number of refugees in the world, 3 million Syrian refugees. The EU has woken up too late to this. The EU needs to support Turkey seriously. And if we learn this lesson for other situations, if we learn this lesson also how we have to interact with African countries, that it is totally meaningless to put pressure on them and say, you take back your own nationals without offering something, that it is totally illusionary to think that we can just send back tens of thousands of people. They never will. Then this lesson from the EU-Turkey agreement, I think, is a valuable one. Because in the end, it's been good for Turkey and it has improved the situation of refugees living in Turkey today.
Thank you very much. I think you already wrapped it up a little bit. Coming to the closing remarks, what are the lessons that you would draw from your evaluation so far? And also, if you could address, if you want to address, for example, discussions about similar agreements with Tunisia, with Libya, and what would be the preconditions that need to be addressed?
I think we have a hard to sort of find agreement around the table that it was necessary and it was timely. I mean, it was a bit late. I agree with Gerald on that, because as I said, the crisis had started in 2011, and most of the international protection schemes, together or separately, were not ready to deal with such an influx. And no one really estimated the numbers. No one really was able to, in fact, identify the challenges that would come with the numbers, and also the proliferation. That's why I made this very important point about the mass influx. And the EU wasn't also ready in terms of this. I mean, they had the 2001 directive, but they weren't ready to put this into sort of place in any way. So there was some solution that needed to be found. So on that account, I think the lesson here is, we talk here about multilateralism and signing agreements and deals and statements. This might be considered in itself an achievement, not a success, but an achievement that came better late than never. So now the important issue from what I see on the ground is that although it came better late than never, although it came with substantial financial support, it needs to really lay down the seeds for coordination and cooperation that's going to go into the next years. And what do I mean by that? In international protection, countries have several options. One of them, send the people back immediately, solve the crises, which happened in the Iraqi crisis to Turkey. People went back, so that was the kind of path dependency that was available available, the learning experience in this, which didn't work. The second is work on integration/social cohesion issues, and that is very hard to solve because there is the geographical limitation, and the due processes we're talking about in resettlement is very hard to accomplish with the existing legislation, all right? So we have these issues now, but Turkey is now going down the route of working on having these people become more self-reliant. And all the challenges we talk about, most disadvantaged communities are available for Syrians as well. And one last point I would like to make here is, I think we're in the very adequate platform to discuss this issue. Why? Turkey has also now put into the country, in a way, has now in the country, poverty. That is in a very different dimension. That's poverty escaping from humanitarian crises, with which it will have to deal with not only from a perspective of international protection, but in the short, medium, and long term from a perspective of development and investing in these people. That's what we talk about here as well, to become resilient and self-reliant wherever they are. And I think this kind of deal will put these on the table, and G20 will be the place to discuss these, which is going to be important.
Thank you. Karl, what are your lessons learned?
The last point I would agree. It's very important when you implement a cash card system in Turkey, in Jordan, now in Greece. Greece is also treated a little bit like Lebanon, Somalia, something in between. But the cash card system, you have to offer also for the local community a benefit. Yeah? Otherwise, it would create additional tension. So it's very important. Concerning, the deal, today we don't discuss the human rights situation in Turkey. So for me, it's quite complicated to separate refugee rights in Turkey and the general human rights situation. But you mentioned that different refugees from Syria now live in a quite protracted situation since 5 to 6 years in camps. For example, near the borders, good camps, but it's not a solution. So again, even without deals, we are against these kind of deals because it's also kind of outsourcing refugee protection and so on. But we would say after 6 years we need durable solution. This is in line with international law, and we need resettlement and to other third countries, and one part will be in Turkey if they get a citizenship or whatever, and to finance this also, to improve even the support in Turkey and other places. We always were in favor of this, but we want an end of the deal in a sense, and you always try to avoid this issue. It's not a question of nice camps in the Aegean. Why people should stay for a month in detention, even if it's blue painted, yeah? No, the point is you cannot implement on an Aegean island a high-tech border procedure and start with a it's all about safe third country, and this was the original plan, and this is not working. And our hope is, and I'm still hopeful, that we stop this via the Strasbourg court. There's a good chance. This is the point, and this is the key threat for the international protection issue concerning Libya, Afghanistan deals, and all the other deals, all this fantasy of Australian solutions. This is not compatible with the Greek situation now. No? This is really the dream of all Ministers of Interior since decades, how to get rid of refugees. Yeah? This was the surprise stories of 2015. So we attack this part. We don't want new detention centers in the Aegean. This is happening now. We don't want that EU colonize, in a way, Greece and force Greece to be not in line with international protection standards. This is, for the first time, I know, the EU Commission, who put pressure on Greece to do this. Europe wants even the vulnerable groups, the Dublin cases, family reunification, they are now not part of the deal. They get access to a normal procedure. And EU Commission coordinator put pressure on Greece, implement it in a different way to kick them and deport them also back to Turkey and so on. And this is the crucial part of the deal, and you know this. And many times you also criticize, they are not delivering, not enough deportation, not enough returns. We talk about human rights and refugee rights, and still the Greek law system and maybe the European courts are in favor of these rights.
I'm going to give the floor again to Gerald because he was addressed directly, and then you'll have the last word. And then I'll open the floor for questions. So,
just one reminder. At this moment, we are facing an unresolved humanitarian catastrophe in the central Mediterranean. So in the EU, in the Aegean, we have 40 people arrive each day. In the central Mediterranean, we have, on average this year, more than 600 people arrive each day. And last year, we had 4,500 people drown. Now, the central Mediterranean crisis, I think, shows us what can happen and what crazy ideas are being put on the table by desperate interior ministers. I mean, deals with Libya, deals with Niger, ideas of islands, etc. Because publics in Europe are asking, isn't there a way that we can control borders effectively and humanely? I think the lesson from the EU-Turkey agreement is that it is possible. Now, what one would need to do in the central Mediterranean to learn this lesson, and this is the key point that Karl also raised, yes, we need a quality but fast asylum procedure. If in the Netherlands it is possible in 6 weeks to make a first instance and appeals procedure that decides whether somebody needs protection in 6 weeks, then what the EU should be working on now is to have this kind of procedure on the Mediterranean border. Greece and Italy should demand this. Because if we are able to decide quickly who is in need of protection or not, who can be sent back to countries of origin in the case of Africa, but then we need to also learn the other lesson from the EU-Turkey agreement. You need to offer countries something. So what we've been proposing in the last few weeks, and I was just in Italy a lot on this recently, is that the EU makes statements with countries of origin in Africa, where it offers them safe and legal passage, organized migration in return for these countries agreeing, like Turkey, to take everyone back of their citizens who is rejected for asylum, in the case of the Nigerians 80%, after a quick and fast procedure. So you stop the dying, you stop the terrible trade, basically trafficking and slavery across Africa, Niger and Libya. You offer safe and legal passage, and you don't get rid of the Refugee Convention, because in fact what you do is you have a fast, credible, quality procedure that is European. Now, if we don't do that, I fear that what we are seeing in the central Mediterranean will give rise again to all the populists who say that what you need to do is build fences inside Europe, abolish the Schengen system, lock in Italy. You know, you hear these voices in Austria, in France, in Switzerland, sometimes even in Germany. So we need solutions. And we need a way to show our publics, our majorities, the majority of member states of the EU, that you can combine control of borders, reduction in irregular arrivals, reduction in the number of people drowning, with protection of refugees and not sending them back. And finding those solutions is hard, implementing them is hard, but we have no choice. Because otherwise we will end up like Australia, where the agenda...
Since 60
yes,
years for a
so
common
far,
European asylum system. Since 1999.
And how many governments are on your side at the moment?
Okay.
No, but this is important.
You talk
need
about
to convince
deals.
Governments.
We want a European protection system, and this would be compatible with the EU values. Yeah. So it's nothing new, but there is no common standard, and there is only a race to the bottom. This is the key problem. And then we have the deals to externalize refugee protection to other countries. That's the point. It's a political crisis in Europe.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open the floor for questions from the audience. There is somebody with not a microphone, but...
Yes, it is a microphone.
It's a microphone. So anybody has a question? Is there a microphone as well? Okay.
Yeah, there is as well.
Oh, it's coming?
Thank you. I'm developing the virtual reality simulation of a refugee's journey from Syria to Germany. I interviewed several refugees who did the journey themselves, and one of the consequences of this deal is having Turkish soldiers on the border in Izmir interviewing randomly whoever they might fit as profile as a Syrian, and then forcing them into militarized camps and not allowing, those camps are seriously militarized, and some people have been so desperate they've gone back to Syria. Another consequence is walking 15 hours through the southern mountains with no water because it's so difficult to, so it's actually made the routes more dangerous, not less dangerous, because now you have to also evade Syrian army and the illegality on that side. Do you address any of that in your work?
Who are you addressing this question?
Whoever wants to answer, really.
I agree.
Well,
This
well, the notion that without this agreement in the Aegean, Turkey would have left the border with Syria open, when in fact it started closing it already in late 2015, is not realistic. Jordan has started stopping people coming into Jordan at around the same time. Turkey has had fights at the border. I mean, there is a lot of reasons and a lot of pressure from the Turkish military and security forces to control the border with Syria, which was open for many years. Now, in this situation, for the Europeans to go to Turkey and say, listen, we think you should let people into your country, and I agree with that. You at the same time need to offer opportunities of resettlement. This is what we also pushed for. And in fact, in the European Parliament, the leader of the CSU of the European People's Party, Manfred Weber, recommended this, taking in a few 10,000 people from Aleppo. Now, I think that in Europe, and this is very important, there are some countries where there is compassion for refugees. We are losing this compassion when people have the sense that the situation is just out of control, everybody can enter Europe, and nobody is ever returned. I think what we need to do and what we need to push for is that those countries in Scandinavia, in the Benelux, in Germany, where there is support to make arguments and say, we need to invest in resettling. We need to take people from Turkey. We need to take family reunification cases. Then we are in a position to give Turkey advice to let more people come in. The notion that the European Union in February 2016 will solve the refugee crisis by building a fence north of its member state, Greece. Building a fence and then locking them into Greece. And that would be better for refugees in Turkey or human rights in Turkey. I can't see how that is, how that is at all plausible. And as for the Turkish military, well, the Turkish military is also at the border with Bulgaria. That has nothing to do with the agreement. If there's no agreement in the Aegean, the Turkish military would guard its borders. So if you think that this deal would now be called off, none of the problems you rightly point to would be better.
Do we have other questions? Just maybe there.
Thank you. I think if you've never been a refugee, it's very easy to go in an office and have a deal. But have you ever thought that these are actual people and they are being pushed from their homes, from their hopes? You know, what I can assure you is that you may block them to come from Europe, but if they are actually running away for their lives, they will go somewhere else. And what is happening in that kind of a deal is just shifting a problem. You don't want to deal with that problem, it will be shifted to Jordan, or people will go to Africa, people will go to everywhere. I lived in Tanzania for 3 years. It's amazing to see how many people who are coming from Syria, who are in East Africa, who are going to other places. So it's not really that refugees will remain where people want them to stay. It's whether what they are running away from has been dealt with or not. So it's just shifting a problem to other people. And my question is, have you also thought about looking at where this problem is going now to make sure that it's addressed at the international level? Otherwise, it's really tough for me, because about 30 years ago, I lived in that kind of experience. And I can tell you with the fact that you will never, as somebody who is not in that situation, you cannot stop somebody who is running away for his life. He will find another option.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yes.
We have time for a very short answer.
This is a very good closing statement.
If nobody wants to respond to that, we could leave it at that. It's a beautiful closing remark. And I thank you very much. Thanks to the panelists for being here and discussing so lively. And I just want to say that at 3:45, the keynote of Mr. Oettinger is starting. We have a very short break now. And thanks very much for your attention and your very important input.